My name is Luna. I'm in my mid 30s now. And for most of my adult life, I've worked inside organizations where the noise is loud, the egos are louder, and the quiet people are often mistaken for background furniture. I'm not a performer. I don't raise my voice in meetings. I don't fight for attention. I've always believed that if your work is solid, it will eventually speak for itself. That belief shaped how people saw me. Colleagues often described me as reliable, calm, and easy to work with. Those are polite words. What they usually meant was safe. Safe to lean on. Safe to overlook. Safe to interrupt. Safe to borrow ideas from without asking. I was the person who stayed composed when others postured. The one who filled in the gaps without announcing it. The one whose name was missing from the slide, while my work was projected on the wall. I don't tell this story as a revenge fantasy. There is no shouting match, no cinematic humiliation, no sudden miracle where everything turns overnight. This is a slower story about perception, about power that grows quietly, and about what happens when patience stops being passive and becomes deliberate. What you're about to hear is a first person account of how credit was taken from me repeatedly, how I noticed long before anyone else did, and how I chose not to react in the way people expected. It's about the moment I realized that silence doesn't have to mean submission, and that restraint, when paired with clarity, can be far more destabilizing than confrontation. There is a confrontation in this story. It happens in a conference room. There are documents, there is a boss present, and there is a moment where everything that was once invisible becomes impossible to ignore. But that moment only matters because of what came before it. The weeks of observation, the internal recalibration, the decision to stop explaining myself to people who benefited from misunderstanding me. I want to be clear about something. This story is not about humiliating someone who wronged me. It's about restoring alignment between truth and recognition, between effort and ownership. It's about emotional justice, not emotional release. If you're looking for rage, you won't find it here. What you will find is calm resolve, documentation, and timing. I'm sharing this because many people live versions of this dynamic every day. They are underestimated, not because they lack ability, but because they don't advertise it. They are trusted with responsibility, but denied authorship. And over time, that quiet erosion does something to you, unless you decide, consciously, to change the pattern. As you listen, you may recognize yourself in pieces of this journey, or you may recognize someone you work with and suddenly understand them differently. Either way, I invite you to listen without rushing to judgment, because this story isn't about winning. It's about choosing when and how to stop losing. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever realized that the way people treat you isn't accidental, but learned? To them, I was dependable, not impressive, not threatening, just dependable. In meetings, I was the one who nodded while others talked. I took notes no one asked me to take. When something broke in a process, someone would glance at me and say, Luna will know, the way you'd talk about a manual, not a person. I wasn't ignored completely. That would have been simpler. I was used gently, consistently, and without ceremony. I worked as a senior operations analyst, which on paper sounded substantial. In reality, it meant I was the connective tissue. I saw how decisions moved from idea to execution, where they warped, where they quietly failed. I fixed problems before they reached leadership, which meant leadership rarely knew they existed. When things went smoothly, it looked effortless. When something went wrong, it looked like a fluke. People assume invisibility comes from weakness. In my case, it came from restraint. I didn't interrupt. I didn't posture. I didn't narrate my effort in real time. When someone asked for help, I gave it without making a performance of generosity. I thought professionalism meant letting the work speak. What I didn't understand yet was that work doesn't speak. People do. So others spoke for me, or more accurately, instead of me. In project meetings, I'd present data quietly, clearly, with sources cited and assumptions explained. Later, someone else would summarize our findings with confidence and get the nods. In follow ups, my charts would reappear with a different name attached to the inside. Not outright theft, nothing dramatic enough to object to without seeming petty. Just enough distance between contribution and recognition to blur ownership. And because I didn't react, the pattern settled. There's a strange social logic in offices. The calm person becomes the container. People pour into you tasks, expectations, assumptions. You absorb them because you can. And eventually, absorbing becomes your identity. She doesn't mind. She's fine. She's not political. Those were the labels I wore without agreeing to them. I was often the last to speak, which meant what I said felt optional. If I raised a concern, it was noted politely and set aside. If someone else echoed the same point later, it became urgent. I noticed this early, but noticing isn't the same as understanding. At first, I thought it was timing, or my delivery, or that I needed more confidence. So I adjusted, subtly. I clarified more. I prepared harder. I sent follow up emails summarizing decisions, always careful with language. Still, the perception didn't change. To them, I was support staff in a senior role, the reliable engine, not the driver. What I didn't do, and this matters, is complain. I didn't vent in hallways. I didn't keep score out loud. I didn't warn anyone that lines were being crossed. Part of me believed that calling attention to it would cheapen the work. Another part feared being labeled difficult. Quiet people learn early that once you speak up, you're often heard through a filter you didn't choose. So I stayed measured, polite, professional, and that, ironically, made it easier. When people misjudge you as passive, they stop masking their behavior. They interrupt you mid sentence without noticing. They forward your analysis without CCing you. They assume proximity equals permission. Over time, they stop seeing you as a boundary at all. I remember a colleague once saying, half joking, "Luna's like our safety net." Everyone laughed. I smiled. Inside, something registered, not pain exactly, but clarity. Safety nets don't get applause, they're only noticed when they fail. At that point in my life, I still believed that if I stayed steady long enough, recognition would arrive organically. That eventually, someone would connect the dots. I didn't yet understand that systems reward visibility, not virtue. But I was watching, quietly, carefully. And while they thought they knew who I was to them, I was beginning, very slowly, to understand who they were to me. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the dangerous thing about small cuts. They don't bleed enough to alarm you. They sting briefly, and then your mind rushes to explain them away. I remember the meeting clearly because nothing about it felt important at the time. A routine project update, a rectangular conference table, coffee that had gone cold before anyone touched it. Ido had spent the previous 2 weeks refining a workflow model that fixed a recurring delay in our operations pipeline. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. I tested edge cases, mapped dependencies, and documented risks. When I presented it, I did what I always did: walked through the logic, answered questions, and shared the file in the group drive. The room nodded. No objections. No fanfare. Later that afternoon, my colleague, Evan, sent an email to leadership. I was CC'd, which is why I noticed. He summarized the new approach and attached my document. His name was in the greeting. His voice was in the framing. Mine was nowhere in the message, except embedded in the work itself. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. My first instinct wasn't anger. It was confusing. Maybe this is normal, I thought. Maybe he assumed it was collaborative. After all, I hadn't explicitly said, "This is mine." I never did. I replied with a neutral line: "Glad this is moving forward. Let me know if there are questions about the assumptions." He replied with a thumbs up emoji. That was the cut. So small it could be dismissed. So subtle it left no clear rule violated. If I brought it up, I'd sound sensitive. If I didn't, it would quietly stand as precedent. I chose the latter, not because I agreed with it, but because I didn't yet understand the cost of letting it pass. What made it worse wasn't the email. It was the follow-up meeting a week later. Our director referenced the improvement and thanked Evan for driving clarity. Evan nodded, gracious, and said something about teamwork. I sat there, hands folded, face neutral, listening to my own thinking described secondhand. No one looked at me. I told myself it didn't matter. That credit wasn't the point. That I was paid to solve problems, not collect praise. This is the story that quiet people tell themselves to stay functional. It's comforting. It's also incomplete. Because what I felt beneath the rationalization was a recalibration. Something in me noted the data point and filed it away. Not emotionally, logistically. This can happen, my mind recorded, and no one will stop it. After that, I became more alert, not suspicious, just observant. I noticed how often Evan positioned himself as the translator of ideas that weren't his, how he'd listen intently, then rephrase with confidence, how leadership responded to tone more than substance, how proximity to authority mattered more than authorship. And I noticed myself doing something dangerous, adapting to accommodate it. I made my explanations shorter. I let others summarize. I stopped pushing back on language. Each time, I told myself it was strategic, efficient, mature, but in truth, I was shrinking my footprint to avoid friction. That's how normalization begins, not with acceptance, but with endurance. The second small cut came faster than the first, then a third. None of them individually justified confrontation. Together, they began to outline a pattern. And patterns, once established, don't need permission anymore. They simply continue. What hurt wasn't the loss of recognition, it was the realization that my silence was being interpreted as consent, that my professionalism was being used as cover, that the line between collaboration and appropriation was being redrawn without my input. Still, I didn't react. Not yet. I was still operating under the belief that clarity would eventually correct things. That if I stayed consistent, the truth would surface on its own. I didn't yet understand that truth, without a witness, is fragile. But something had shifted. I stopped assuming goodwill. I started paying attention to structure. And once you see the structure, you can't unsee it. By the time I admitted it to myself, the behavior was no longer surprising. That's how normalization works. The first time feels like an exception. The second time feels uncomfortable. By the fifth or sixth, your body adjusts before your mind does. You stop flinching. You start preparing explanations in advance, not for others, but for yourself. Evan began speaking for me in meetings. If I raised a point, he'd jump in before I finished and repackage it with more energy, more certainty. People responded to him, not because he was clearer, but because he sounded decisive. And I didn't interrupt to reclaim the thought. The room quietly reassigned ownership. I told myself I was being generous, that this was what teamwork looked like. But generosity only works when it's chosen. What I was practicing was accommodation. I noticed how often people assumed I would handle the details. The unspoken translation was simple. You'll do the labor. Someone else will do the talking. And because I did handle the details, well, thoroughly, without complaint, the assumption hardened into expectation. Once, during a project review, the director asked a question about a risk mitigation plan I had built. Evan answered, incorrectly. I corrected him gently. The director nodded, but the follow-up questions still went to Evan. Accuracy mattered less than familiarity. That was the moment I understood something unsettling. Competence doesn't threaten a system built on confidence unless it insists on being seen. So I rationalized my silence. I told myself I didn't want to be political. I told myself I valued peace. I told myself recognition wasn't why I did the work. Each explanation sounded virtuous. Each one also kept me exactly where I was. What I didn't say out loud was this. Part of me was afraid that if I spoke up, I'd be dismissed. Or worse, reframed as emotional. Quiet people learn early that once you show discomfort, the narrative can flip fast. Suddenly, you're not principled. You're sensitive, not precise, difficult. So I chose containment over confrontation. The disrespect became routine. Evan forwarded my analyses as attachments without context. He scheduled meetings about his initiatives that were built entirely on my groundwork. When leadership praised outcomes, he accepted it with practiced humility, occasionally gesturing toward the team, a vague collective that never quite landed on me. And I let it happen. Not because I didn't care, but because I was still operating under the hope that endurance would be noticed, that someone would connect the dots and say, wait, Luna's fingerprints are on all of this. No one did. Systems don't correct themselves. They reward what they recognize. The more I stayed quiet, the more my quietness became part of the system. I was dependable, low friction, easy. And once someone benefits from that version of you, they unconsciously protect it. What surprised me wasn't Evan's behavior. was how little resistance there was from everyone else. People aren't cruel most of the time, they're simply efficient. They go with the version of reality that costs them the least to maintain. And challenging misattribution costs effort. So I watched. I noted timestamps. I kept drafts. I saved messages. Not with anger, but with intention. Something in me had stopped hoping and started preparing, though I didn't yet know for what. I still showed up, still delivered, still smiled when appropriate. But inside, the equation had changed. Silence was no longer my default. It was becoming a variable. It became clear to me one afternoon, not in a meeting, not during conflict, but in a casual moment that no one else would remember. We were standing by the printer. Evan was joking with another colleague about how chaotic the quarter had been. Someone said, "Honestly, I don't know how we'd survive without Luna holding everything together." They meant it as a compliment. Everyone laughed. I smiled. The printer whirred, and in that small pause, the role crystallized. I wasn't the strategist. I wasn't the originator. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed pressure so others could shine. Once I saw it everywhere. How tasks landed on my desk without discussion. How deadlines became my responsibility, even when decisions weren't. In how people spoke around my work rather than to me about it. The role was clear, reliable, useful, invisible. And the most dangerous part? I had helped create it. Every time I said, "It's fine, I'll handle it." Every time I fixed something quietly instead of escalating. Every time I let someone else summarize my thinking. I didn't want to seem territorial. I thought I was being mature. What I was really doing was teaching people how to treat me. Roles in organizations are rarely assigned formally. They're negotiated through repetition, through what you tolerate, through what you don't correct. Once the pattern locks in, deviating from it feels like a violation, even when it shouldn't. I noticed how differently people responded to me versus Evan. When he spoke, people leaned forward. When I spoke, they nodded and moved on. Not because I lacked authority, but because I wasn't expected to exercise it. Expectation shapes attention. I also noticed something else, something quieter, but more important. Evan didn't fear me. He didn't even see me as competition. In his mind, I was infrastructure, necessary, but static, not someone who would challenge a narrative or disrupt a flow. That miscalculation would matter later. At the time, though, it simply clarified my position. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I was sober, clear eyed. The emotional fog had lifted, replaced by something colder and more useful: understanding. If I continued as I was, nothing would change. Not slowly, not organically, not ever. But I also knew this. Abruptly rejecting the role would trigger resistance. Systems protect themselves. If I suddenly demanded visibility, I'd be framed clearly as the problem. So I didn't reject it. I studied it. I paid attention to where information flowed, who signed off on what, and whose name appeared where. I noticed how leadership consumed updates, what they skimmed, what they remembered. I learned which meetings mattered and which were theater. And I did all of this without changing my demeanor. Still calm, still reliable, still quiet. Because when people believe you've accepted a role, they stop guarding against you leaving it. That was the moment I stopped asking, "Why are they doing this to me?" and started asking, What does this role allow me to see? The answer was everything. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no argument, no email, no raised voice. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, in a moment so quiet it almost felt insignificant until it wasn't. I was alone in a small conference room, reviewing a project timeline that had just been approved. Evan had presented it that morning. Leadership loved it. The praise was generous. The direction was set. As I scanned the document, my stomach tightened, not with jealousy, but with recognition. The timeline was mine, not inspired by, not influenced by. It was my structure, my sequencing, my risk buffers, copied cleanly with only cosmetic changes. Even the phrasing of certain notes was identical to my private draft, the one I had shared with Evan weeks earlier when he'd asked for a second opinion. For the first time, there was no ambiguity. This wasn't a collaborative blur, this was a transfer. I closed the file and sat back. I didn't feel angry, I felt awake. There's a moment when something you've been half accepting snaps into focus, and your body responds before your thoughts do. My breathing slowed, my shoulders dropped, the noise in my head went quiet. What replaced it wasn't emotion, it was resolve. So, this is what's happening, I thought. And just as importantly, this is how it's allowed to happen. I realized then that my silence hadn't been misunderstood. It had been interpreted correctly as permission. Not maliciously, perhaps, but functionally. I had been signaling that I would not defend boundaries I never articulated. That realization didn't make me feel weak. It made me feel responsible. Not responsible for Evan's choices, but for mine. In that room, I made a decision. Not about him, about myself. I would stop hoping for recognition. I would stop correcting gently. I would stop assuming fairness would emerge on its own. But I also wouldn't confront him. Not yet. Because confrontation without leverage is just noise. What shifted that day was internal. My relationship with silence changed. It stopped being a habit and became a tool. Something I could choose, shape, and eventually release. I opened my notebook, the slim graphite one I always carried. I wrote the date. I listed facts. No adjectives, no emotion, just sequence, access, evidence. Then I closed it. I walked back to my desk. I answered messages. I smiled when someone thanked Evan again for his leadership. I didn't correct them because for the first time, I wasn't enduring. I was positioning. From the outside, nothing changed. I still arrived early, still responded promptly, still spoke when spoken to. If anything, I became easier to work with, less corrective, less explanatory. I stopped volunteering context unless it was explicitly requested. I stopped finishing other people's sentences. I stopped rescuing conversations that drifted off course. People interpreted this exactly as you'd expect. They thought I was disengaging. They thought I was tired. They thought I'd accepted my place and settled into it. Evan especially relaxed. He filled the space I left behind quickly and loudly. He summarized more, presented more, took ownership of more. And because nothing pushed back, he assumed the expansion was natural, earned even. This is the mistake people make when they confuse quiet with weakness. They believe the quiet person isn't watching. What they didn't notice was how deliberate my silence had become. I stopped correcting errors in public and began documenting them privately. I stopped clarifying attribution in meetings and started tracking timelines. I noted when drafts were shared, when language reappeared, and when decisions were credited elsewhere. I saved versions. I preserved metadata, not obsessively, methodically. Silence gave me space. When you stop reacting, you start seeing patterns more clearly. You hear who speaks with certainty and who speaks with knowledge. You notice which decisions are rubber stamped and which are scrutinized. You learn where authority actually sits, not on the org chart, but in habit. I also noticed how much emotional labor I had been providing without realizing it. I used to soften conversations, anticipate misunderstandings, and smooth tensions before they surfaced. When I withdrew that cushioning, meetings became sharper, more abrupt. People felt the friction but couldn't locate its source. They didn't look at me. Why would they? I was still calm, still polite, still invisible. That invisibility became camouflage. Evan began to overreach. He promised outcomes without consulting the underlying data. He spoke confidently about dependencies he didn't fully understand. He relied on the assumption that if something went wrong, I'd quietly fix it, as I always had. I didn't. Not dramatically, not maliciously. I simply did exactly what was asked. Nothing more. No anticipatory patching, no silent corrections, no off-hours rescues. The system began to creak. Small delays appeared. Questions went unanswered longer than usual. Leadership noticed the friction, but attributed it to scale, not structure. Evan worked harder to compensate, which only made him more visible. Still, I said nothing. This is the part people misunderstand when they hear stories like this. They imagine silence as passive aggressive, as avoidance. What they don't see is the discipline it takes not to intervene when you're capable of doing so. I wasn't waiting for failure. I was allowing accuracy. And accuracy, left alone long enough, reveals everything. Emotionally, something else shifted too. I felt steadier, less reactive. The low-level resentment I hadn't admitted to myself began to dissolve. Not because the situation improved, but because I stopped expecting it to. Expectation is a kind of attachment. Letting go of it freed up energy I didn't know I was spending. I no longer needed Evan to acknowledge me. I no longer needed leadership to notice me organically. I needed alignment, and alignment requires evidence. So I kept choosing silence, not as retreat, but as positioning. Every quiet moment was a brick. Every uncorrected misstep is a data point. Every assumption made about me is a layer of insulation between perception and reality. They mistook that insulation for absence. It wasn't. It was containment. And it was working. What they never noticed was how much access invisibility gives you. When people stop seeing you as a variable, they stop guarding information around you. Conversations happen in front of you, not with you. Drafts are forwarded casually. Assumptions are spoken aloud. You become part of the environment, present, but not perceived as influential. That's when preparation truly began. I didn't announce anything. I didn't change my tone. I didn't suddenly become sharp or distant. I simply listened more than I spoke. And when I spoke, I kept it factual, neutral, unmemorable. Behind the scenes, I built a parallel record. Every time Evan asked for input, I noted the date and the version I shared. Every time language from my drafts appeared in his presentations, I archived the comparison. I tracked how often leadership praised outcomes without asking about process and who answered when they finally did. This wasn't about catching someone in a lie. It was about mapping behavior over time. Patterns are harder to dismiss than incidents. I also deepened my understanding of the systems we relied on, not just the workflows, but the approval chains. Who signed off on what? Where audit trails lived? Which documents were considered authoritative and which were treated as supporting material? Most people don't bother learning this unless they're trying to climb. I wasn't climbing. I was stabilizing leverage. I realized something important during this phase. Evan's visibility depended heavily on my quiet corrections, on the fact that things worked. As long as outputs were clean, no one asked how they got there. The moment accuracy faltered, questions surfaced. But by then, the source material mattered. And I was the source material. Still, I didn't rush. Preparation without patience is just panic in disguise. Emotionally, I stayed even. I didn't vent to coworkers. I didn't hint at frustration. I didn't build alliances. That part is tempting, but alliances leak. And I didn't want sympathy. I wanted alignment with truth. I also began to notice something else they missed. Leadership valued documentation more than charisma when things went wrong. In calm times, confidence carried the room. In unstable moments, paper spoke louder. So I made sure my paper spoke clearly. Dates, file paths, version histories, emails with neutral language, comments that showed intent without accusation. Nothing editorial, nothing emotional. Just facts, arranged so they could be followed by someone who wasn't invested in either of us. This wasn't about revenge. I wasn't imagining a dramatic reveal. I didn't know when, or even if, I'd use what I was collecting. But I knew this. If the moment came, I would not need to raise my voice. And that changed everything. The private reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush, no triumph, no surge of satisfaction. It arrived the way clarity usually does, quietly, almost clinically, when enough information finally aligns and stops asking questions. I was reviewing a quarterly summary late one evening, long after most of the office lights had gone dark. The building hum was low, steady, the kind of silence that makes your thoughts sharper. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was just checking consistency, inputs against outputs, claims against sources, and then I saw it. A discrepancy so small, most people would have skimmed past it. A timeline that assumed access to data Evan didn't have. A justification that referenced a decision made before he'd even been looped in. On its own, it meant nothing. In context, it meant everything. Because I knew exactly where that information came from. Me, not from a meeting, not from a shared doc. From a one-on-one conversation weeks earlier, where I had spoken hypothetically about a risk scenario, clearly labeled as such. That hypothetical had now been reframed as precedent, woven into a formal recommendation, and attributed implicitly to Evan's experience. I leaned back and let the moment settle. This was the proof I hadn't been seeking, but had been preparing for. I pulled up my records, the dated note in my notebook, the calendar invite, the email where Evan had followed up with a vague, "Thanks, super helpful." The draft he'd circulated later now aligned almost word for word with that hypothetical. There it was. Not theft in the dramatic sense, something more insidious, narrative laundering. ideas moving through someone else until they appeared clean of origin. What surprised me wasn't the discovery, it was how calm I felt. Because with clarity comes choice. I saw fully what I had been part of, how my restraint had enabled efficiency for everyone but me. Evan hadn't needed to be malicious. The system rewarded exactly what he was doing. And how I now had something the system respected: traceability. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long moment, not planning a confrontation, not rehearsing speeches, just acknowledging reality without flinching. This was leverage, but not in the way people imagine it. Leverage isn't about power over someone, it's about freedom from uncertainty, about knowing that if the ground shifts, you won't fall through it. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt grounded. And for the first time since this began, I stopped asking myself what I should do and started asking what I was willing to do. Those are very different questions. Once you truly see the whole board, you can no longer pretend you're just a piece moving at someone else's discretion. That awareness didn't arrive as a rush of courage or a spike of anger. It arrived as stillness, a settling, the kind that comes when uncertainty finally burns off and leaves only responsibility behind. For several days after my private realization, I moved through work as usual. Same routines, same calm tone, same measured pace. But internally, something had shifted from observation to evaluation. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. I began to lay out my options, not emotionally, but structurally. The first option was the one most people imagine: a private confrontation, a closed door conversation with Evan, calm, professional. I could show him what I had noticed: the timelines, the overlaps, the unmistakable lineage of ideas. I could give him the benefit of dignity and allow him to explain himself. I imagined that conversation carefully. He would look surprised, then apologetic. He would say it wasn't intentional. Those things moved fast. Those leadership expectations were intense. That he thought of us as a team. He might even offer to make it right going forward. And then what? Even in the best case version, the dynamic wouldn't truly change. It would only become cautious. He'd be more careful about what he took, but not about what he claimed. The imbalance would remain, just dressed in politeness. I would have invested vulnerability into someone who had already demonstrated how he handled unguarded access. That option asked me to trust someone who benefited from my trust too easily, so I set it aside. The second option was informal escalation, strategic visibility. I could start clarifying ownership in meetings, casually attach my name to work, phrase contributions more assertively. Maybe mention in passing how long I'd been developing certain frameworks. But that path had a hidden cost. It would turn the situation into a narrative contest. Once something becomes subjective, who really did what, who remembers what, the truth becomes negotiable. People start smoothing edges, avoiding discomfort. Leadership prefers harmony over forensic accuracy, unless accuracy is unavoidable. I would be framed as suddenly territorial, or worse, political. The very qualities that had kept me trusted would be recast as flaws the moment I asserted them. That option required me to slowly argue my way back into visibility. I didn't want to argue. The third option was the cleanest on the surface: leave, find another role, another company, another system, carry my competence elsewhere, and let this environment become someone else's problem. I considered it seriously. There is relief in walking away from a distortion without correcting it. No confrontation, no tension, just distance. Many people choose this, and I understand why. But when I imagined it fully, when I pictured Evan continuing to speak confidently about systems I had built, frameworks I had shaped, decisions I had informed, I felt something tighten. Not anger, finality. Leaving without correction would turn the misattribution into history. Once it hardened into a record, it would follow him. Promotions, opportunities, authority. Meanwhile, my resume would remain oddly understated, my impact implied but never anchored. I would be starting over, not just elsewhere but from a false baseline. That option asked me to swallow the cost quietly. I had done enough of that. As I weighed these paths, I noticed something else. Every reversible option preserved my comfort. Every irreversible one demanded clarity at the expense of ease. And that was the real decision. Quiet dominance isn't about patience forever. It's about choosing the moment when patience stops serving truth. I asked myself a harder question than not what would fix this, but what kind of person do I want to be after this is over? Someone who endured and adapted? Or someone who aligned action with reality, even when it disrupted the surface calm? The answer was uncomfortable, but unmistakable. I realized that any path that allowed ambiguity to remain was no longer acceptable to me. Not because ambiguity was unfair, but because it was corrosive. It slowly rewrote the story of who I was and what I contributed. So I chose the irreversible option, not impulsively, not emotionally, deliberately. I decided that when I acted, it would be in a room where accuracy mattered more than ego, a room where documentation outweighed charisma, a room where the story would be anchored permanently, not negotiated. I wouldn't accuse Evan. Accusations invite defense. I wouldn't explain my feelings. Feelings invite dismissal. I wouldn't demand recognition. Demands invite resistance. I would present evidence, chronology, provenance, process. And I would do it once. That choice carried consequences I didn't minimize. Once I stepped out of invisibility, there would be no stepping back in. The easy version of me, the one people leaned on without accountability, would disappear. Some relationships would cool, some assumptions would fracture, but what would replace them would be real. After making that decision, everything else became mechanical, calm, almost peaceful. I reviewed upcoming meetings, noted agendas, identified which materials would be referenced and which questions leadership was likely to ask. I didn't insert myself prematurely. I didn't signal anything had changed. I simply prepared. That was the moment the story stopped being about Evan. It became about alignment. And alignment, once chosen, does not negotiate. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel urgency. That surprises people when I say it. They expect momentum, quick action, visible moves, some outward signal that something is about to change. But urgency is emotional, and I wasn't operating emotionally anymore. I was operating precisely. Moving in silence didn't mean doing nothing. It meant doing only what advanced alignment, and nothing that relieved pressure prematurely. I began by tightening my scope. For years, I had extended myself beyond what was formally required. I filled gaps before they were acknowledged. I anticipated needs before they were articulated. The generosity had blurred responsibility lines in a way that benefited everyone except me. So I stopped, not abruptly, not definitely. I simply adhered to role boundaries as written. If something wasn't assigned to me, I didn't absorb it. If a request lacked clarity, I asked for it in writing. If a decision required input from someone else, I waited for that input instead of compensating for its absence. From the outside, I still looked cooperative. Internally, I had become exact. At the same time, I prepared my materials. I didn't assemble a case, I assembled a timeline. I organized documents chronologically, not thematically. I made it easy for someone else to follow the evolution of ideas without interpretation. Drafts led to revisions, messages led to deliverables. Language repeated itself across contexts in ways that didn't need explanation. I resisted the urge to annotate emotionally. No highlighting, no commentary, no arrows pointing to conclusions. The strength of the record was its restraint. If someone needed help understanding it, that would be their question, not my argument. I also paid attention to timing. There's a difference between truth and impact. Truth can exist quietly for a long time. Impact requires placement. I waited for a moment when leadership would already be scrutinizing outcomes, when curiosity would be active, not defensive. That moment came sooner than expected. A project Evan had confidently advanced began to stall, not catastrophically, just enough to draw attention. Dependencies were misjudged. Risks materialized exactly where I had once flagged them hypothetically. Leadership scheduled a review to understand what had gone wrong. I was invited, as usual. Evan was still the lead. No one suspected anything. In the days leading up to that meeting, I didn't sleep less. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't imagine reactions. I reviewed my materials once, then left them alone. There's a calm that comes when you know you're not trying to convince anyone, only to place information where it belongs. During that period, people around me sensed something had changed, though they couldn't name it. I was less available, more contained, still kind, but no longer cushioning. A colleague asked if I was thinking of leaving. I smiled and said, I'm just focused, which was true. What they didn't see was that by moving in silence, I was allowing the system to reveal its own weak points. Without my constant correction, small inaccuracies propagated. Without my smoothing, conversations sharpened. The contrast wasn't dramatic, but it was cumulative. And importantly, it wasn't personal. Nothing I did targeted Evan directly. I didn't undermine him. I didn't withhold information he formally requested. I didn't set traps. I simply stopped protecting outcomes I didn't own. That distinction matters. Because when consequences begin, the question is no longer who caused this. It becomes why didn't anyone see it earlier? And that question opens doors that facts can walk through. By the time the review meeting arrived, the environment had shifted subtly. Leadership was alert, curious, ready to examine assumptions. I arrived with my notebook and my folder. I sat where I always sat, still quiet, still calm, still underestimated, and fully prepared. The consequences didn't arrive with blame, they arrived in confusion. The review meeting started the way these meetings always did: measured concern, neutral language, a shared assumption that something external had gone wrong. Market timing, resource constraints, communication gaps, safe explanations that don't require accountability. Evan spoke first. He walked through the project with confidence, pointing to milestones, reframing delays as unexpected complexity. Leadership listened, but this time they didn't nod as easily. Questions lingered longer. Clarifications were requested twice, then 3 times. Something felt off. Not wrong, just incomplete. When leadership asked about a specific decision point, the one tied to the risk I had flagged months earlier, Evan hesitated. Just a fraction. He answered, but his explanation was thin. It relied on assumptions rather than sources. That's when the room changed. Not dramatically, subtly. Attention sharpened. Someone asked, "Do we have documentation on when this was decided and by whom?" Evan glanced down at his laptop, scrolled, paused. "I can follow up," he said. The director nodded slowly, then looked around the table. "Luna," she said, almost as an afterthought, "you were close to this work early on. Do you have any context here?" I didn't rush to speak. I didn't correct him. I didn't challenge his framing. I simply opened my folder. "Yes," I said. "I can share the timeline." The room went quiet. Not tense, just attentive. I walked them through it calmly. Dates, drafts, emails, how the risk had been discussed, labeled hypothetical, and noted for later evaluation. How that hypothetical had later been referenced as precedent. How the assumption had shifted without a decision being made. No accusations, no adjectives, just sequence. As I spoke, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not satisfied. Relief. Because I wasn't holding anything back anymore. I wasn't compressing reality to preserve comfort. Evan didn't interrupt. He looked confused, not panicked, but disoriented. Like someone realizing the ground they'd been standing on had moved slightly, without warning. The director asked for the files. I handed them over. The meeting ended early. No conclusions were announced. No judgments delivered. Leadership thanked everyone and said they'd review the materials. As we filed out, no one spoke much. Conversations stayed light, cautious. Evan avoided my eyes, not out of guilt, but uncertainty. He didn't yet understand what had happened. That's how consequences begin. Not with punishment, but with imbalance. In the days that followed, small things changed. Leadership asked more questions and directed them to me. Not pointedly, casually, as if recalibrating their mental map. Emails included me earlier in threads. Requests for clarification came directly, not through Evan. Nothing was said out loud, but the system had started to correct itself. Evan became more careful. He asked more questions. He stopped summarizing my work without looping me in. Not because he'd been reprimanded, but because uncertainty had entered the equation. And once uncertainty appears, confidence alone is no longer enough. I didn't celebrate. I didn't lean into visibility. I stayed steady because I knew this wasn't the climax. It was the beginning of the end of something that had been allowed to run too long. Once the questions started, they didn't stop. That's the thing about systems built on assumed competence. They function smoothly until scrutiny appears. Then every shortcut, every blurred boundary, every unexamined claim becomes visible all at once. Not because someone exposed them, but because they were never designed to withstand attention. Evan tried to fix it. At first, subtly. He sent follow-up emails clarifying points no one had asked about. He scheduled alignment meetings, looping me in with a friendliness that felt newly deliberate. He began using phrases like building on Luna's early work and as Luna and I discussed, as if retroactive attribution could rebalance months of narrative drift. It was too late for that. Not because I refused it, but because leadership no longer accepted summaries at face value. They wanted sources, They wanted version histories. They wanted to know who had decided what and when. And suddenly, the answers couldn't be improvised. In one meeting, a senior manager asked Evan to walk through the evolution of a key framework, step by step. He did his best, but the story lacked texture. Decisions appeared fully formed. Trade offs were described vaguely. When asked why certain paths were rejected, he couldn't say. Those weren't his failures as a person. They were the natural result of representing work you didn't originate. You can memorize conclusions, but you can't reproduce the thinking that led there unless you lived it. That gap showed, quietly, repeatedly. I didn't correct him in real time. I wasn't asked to. Leadership had learned instinctively that interrupting less often revealed more. After meetings, Evan would linger, ask if I could sync on context. I always agreed, but I didn't reconstruct the past for him. I answered exactly what was asked, nothing more. The same professional restraint I'd always shown, now working in a different direction. You can't repair a pattern once it's been named internally, even if no one says the name out loud. Panic didn't look like drama. It looked like overcompensation. Evan began over-preparing slides, filling them with language meant to sound rigorous. But rigor isn't volume, it's coherence. And the more he tried to control the narrative, the more fragmented it became. Leadership noticed, not emotionally, structurally. They began requesting materials directly from me, not as a signal, but as a solution. My documents were cleaner. My explanations followed causality. My answers didn't require revision. The contrast did the work for me. There was a moment, brief, almost forgettable, when I realized the outcome was sealed. It was after a meeting where the director said, "Let's have Luna lead the next review. I want continuity." Evan nodded. What else could he do? By then, any attempt to fix it would have required explaining why it needed fixing in the first place. That explanation would have required acknowledging what had been happening. And no one wants to volunteer that. The system didn't punish Evan. It reoriented around accuracy. And once that happens, roles don't revert. They settle. The confrontation didn't happen the way people imagine confrontation. There was no raised voice, no accusations, no emotional unraveling. In fact, if someone had walked past the conference room, they might have assumed it was just another routine discussion, except for one moment. One sound, one action that cut through months of quiet misalignment. The director had scheduled a smaller follow-up meeting. Just three of us. Her, Evan, me. The purpose was simple. Final accountability before the next phase moved forward. We sat at opposite sides of the table. Evan looked composed, but there was tension in his posture. A careful alertness that hadn't been there before. I placed my folder in front of me. The same one I'd carried for weeks. Plain, unmarked. The director began by asking Evan to summarize the project's evolution again. Briefly this time. He spoke cautiously, choosing his words with care. He referenced collaboration more explicitly now, used my name, framed decisions as shared. When he finished, there was a pause. Then the director turned to me. "Luna," she said evenly, "is that an accurate representation?" I didn't answer immediately. I opened the folder, and for the first time in this entire process, I changed my physical behavior. I stood slightly, leaned forward, and placed the files down on the table between us, firmly, not violently, not dramatically, but with enough force that the sound landed. A clean, unmistakable thud. Evan flinched. Just a little. "These," I said calmly, are the original drafts, notes, and decision logs. Dated, versioned, tracked. They show when the core frameworks were developed, how the risks were identified, and how assumptions shifted over time. I slid the top document forward, not toward the director, but toward the center. Shared space, neutral ground. I've been quiet because I believed the work would speak for itself, I continued. It didn't, so I'm letting the record do it instead. No blame, no, you took, no, you lied. Just reality. The director flipped through the pages. Slowly, carefully. She didn't rush. She didn't look at Evan. She didn't need to. The silence stretched. Not awkward, but heavy with recognition. Evan opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to counter with. No alternative record. No competing timeline. Only reinterpretation. And reinterpretation doesn't stand up to documentation. I see, the director said finally. 2 words. Quiet, final. She closed the folder and looked at Evan then. Not angrily, but clearly. This helps clarify ownership, she said. We'll need to adjust how responsibilities are assigned going forward. That was it. No lecture, no public shaming, no emotional reckoning. The correction happened at the level that mattered. Structure. The meeting ended shortly after. As we stood to leave, Evan lingered for half a second. I could feel him wanting to say something, an apology, an explanation, a softening gesture. I didn't wait for it, not out of cruelty, but because this wasn't about closure between us. It was about accuracy in the open, and that had already been restored. After that meeting, there was no dramatic shift in the atmosphere. No one whispered. No one avoided me. No one congratulated me in the hallway. And that, more than anything, told me the correction had landed exactly where it needed to. Quietly, structurally, without spectacle. My role changed, but not in the way titles change. What changed was orientation. People began to come to me earlier, not later. Questions were framed with curiosity instead of assumptions. When decisions were summarized, my name wasn't added ceremonially. It was included naturally, as part of the factual chain. I didn't become louder. I didn't become sharper. I didn't perform authority. I became anchored. The version of me that had absorbed chaos silently didn't disappear out of bitterness. She dissolved because she was no longer required. I stopped cushioning outcomes that weren't mine. I stopped smoothing over misunderstandings that benefited from being exposed. And interestingly, the work became easier, not lighter, but cleaner. I slept better. I carried less mental residue home. I no longer replayed meetings in my head, wondering if I should have said something differently. When I spoke now, it was because the moment required it, not because I feared being erased. Evan adjusted. That's the most accurate word for it. He became more precise, more collaborative in the real sense. Our interactions were professional, measured, and distant in a way that felt appropriate. There was no animosity, just a recalibration of proximity. We were no longer misaligned. What surprised me most was how little resentment I felt. I had imagined, earlier in the process, that standing up for myself would come with emotional turbulence, that there would be anger to process or satisfaction to manage. Instead, there was only clarity. Clarity has a calming effect. I also saw myself differently. I stopped mistaking restraint for invisibility. I understood now that quiet strength only works when it's paired with boundaries. Without them, it's just availability. With them, it's authority that doesn't need to announce itself. I didn't become someone else. I became more accurate about who I already was. There's a particular confidence that comes from knowing you don't need to over explain, overperform, or overextend. From knowing that if something matters, you can place it in the open and let it stand. That confidence doesn't shout, it settles, and once it does, it stays. There's a quiet myth we're taught early on that if you do good work consistently, recognition will eventually find you. That integrity has its own gravity, that staying calm and professional is enough to protect what you build. Sometimes that's true, and sometimes it isn't. What this experience taught me is not that people are malicious, but that systems are efficient. They reward what's visible, repeatable, and easy to categorize. If your contribution lives quietly in the background, it can be absorbed by louder narratives without anyone consciously choosing to take it. That doesn't make you weak, but it does make you responsible for how long you allow it. Quiet dominance isn't about confrontation, it's about precision. It's knowing when silence is serving truth and when it's protecting distortion. It's understanding that boundaries don't have to be loud to be immovable. I didn't win anything in the traditional sense. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't rewrite the past publicly. What I did was restore alignment between effort and ownership, between contribution and recognition. And once alignment is restored, there's a deep, steady calm that follows. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: silence is powerful, but only when it's chosen. When silence is automatic, it teaches others how to treat you. When it's deliberate, it teaches them where the line is. You don't need to announce your worth, but you do need to protect its record. I'm sharing this not as a template, but as a mirror. Many of us are carrying invisible labor, assuming someone will eventually notice. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And when they don't, the question isn't whether you should become louder, it's whether you're willing to become clear. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment where staying quiet cost you more than speaking up would have? And how did you decide what to do next?